Welcome to Responsible AI, the podcast for the AI Forum. Here on the podcast, we engage in critical dialogue with legal minds, tech experts, and other big thinkers on AI's legal and societal impacts, offering deep dives into public policy and best practices. Responsible AI is hosted by Alex Albin, director of the AI Forum, and me, your producer, Rebecca Staffel. You can learn more at our website, theaiforum.org. We're talking today with Leonard Garfield, Executive Director of the Museum of History and Industry, or as we here in Seattle call it, MOHAI. Few people have done more to shape how Seattle understands its own story than Leonard Garfield. Leonard has led MOHAI since 1999, guiding its transformation from a modest Montlake space into the iconic armory at Lake Union Park. A historian by training, he previously led Washington State's Historic Preservation Programs and King County's Office of Cultural Resources. Under his leadership, MOHAI has been recognized by USA Today as one of the top 10 history museums in the nation. Leonard Garfield, welcome to the show, and hello, Alex Albin.
Leonard, it's wonderful to have you here, and we really appreciate your time today.
Well, it is absolutely great to be with you, Alex, and hello, Rebecca. It's great to talk to you.
Why don't we start on a kind of personal note by asking you a little bit about how did you end up first being a historian and second being a museum director, unless that was always a lifelong goal since you were age, 5 or 6?
I'm not sure it was a lifelong goal, but I've sometimes reflected on why am I interested in history? And I think it has something to do with the fact that growing up, I had the opportunity to live in a variety of different communities. We moved around a bit as a family. And I was fascinated by how each place was different and in its own way unique. But I also began to recognize that there were these commonalities, that in many ways every place was different, but every place was the same. And I think that got me to thinking about what is it that brings us together as a community? What makes us special? And of course, so much of that is our history. So I think that's really what led me into really a passion for history and for culture more broadly. And that shaped my education and eventually my career.
The Museum of History and Industry is fairly unique, and I kind of wonder when I tell friends, is it an art museum? Is it a cultural institution? Is it what we would call a unicorn in the tech world? How would you describe MOHAI to third parties?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I don't think it's a unicorn. I think there are some other institutions that are like it, but you're right, Alex, not too many. It's really a museum about place. It's a museum about community, about who we are and where we're going. And so in that sense, it pulls together history, but it pulls together history in a broader sense. Really, what is the culture of this community? And of course, relevant to this podcast, this is a community that has a strong culture of innovation. And so innovation becomes a leading edge, not just looking at it in a sort of futuristic way, but understanding it as a fundamental building block of who we not only are, but who we've been for literally generations. And so I would say, what is MOHAI about? It's a museum about this place that we all live in.
I want to expand on that for a second, because innovation is the key to so many things in our economy and our society, and it is very much reflected in the exhibits at MOHAI, starting with the Boeing legacy that is evident, of course, both in Seattle. I remember, what was it in the 1970s? I don't know if you were here at that point, but the last person to come in Seattle, please turn off the lights.
Yep, the Boeing bust.
The Boeing bust.
We called it.
And you reflect the fact that there are booms and busts in a technology economy. I think it's so funny today when people are talking about AI and they say it's just a bubble. And true enough, there are aspects of overenthusiasm, or what Alan Greenspan might have said were irrational exuberance regarding AI. But hasn't that always been the case, Leonard? Was there irrational exuberance for Boeing or other things that you've seen come and go as reflected in your exhibits?
Well, there's definitely exuberance. I think the qualifier there is irrational. And I think that innovators are really true believers. They have to believe that the future is going to unfold in a certain way. And one of the things we share at MOHAI is the notion that risk is a part of the innovative pathway that has been true historically. And that means that failure is a part of it. And that's not irrational, that's logical. That's common sense as well as key to moving forward. And so I think in every one of these innovations, we've seen that quote unquote irrationality end up being failure only to then become a building block for success. Let's look at Boeing, for example. It began really as an outgrowth of the boat building industry. Bill Boeing wanted boats that flew, and he was lucky to get some of those major contracts in World War I. But following the war, the contracts disappeared, and his business really had to dig down to see what could they be. And so they went into furniture making, and they went into the things that did not fly, only to then reemerge decades later as the preeminent airplane builder in the world. So his exuberance in those early decades might have been irrational, but it was all part of a larger pathway of creation and innovation that obviously yielded a tremendous impact on the world.
In the technology industry, I think we refer to that sometimes as pivoting, right? Boeing had to pivot from certain kinds of airplanes during the war to create more military production. And we may see companies continue to pivot, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Companies are responding to the pressures of the economy, society, wars. And I think that that's great that we have an institution here in Seattle that really enables us to reflect on that. History is long, and I know that you've had so many exhibits. I don't know if you want to mention some of your favorites that really talk about our historical legacy, starting with the Seattle Fire and others.
And that's one of our favorite exhibits because there's a little bit of a sort of a sense of humor in that, in the way we tell the story of the Great Seattle Fire. I mean, one of the things, Alex, that we try to do is history becomes irrelevant when it becomes a trope, when it becomes so familiar that as soon as we hear the topic, we know the story, we know the answers. Really, history is a tool if we continue to interrogate it and really understand what lessons it holds. And so the Great Seattle Fire is one of those stories that we felt, if we just keep telling it in the same way it's always been told, people are going to become, deafened to the real lessons. But the real lesson of that story is that here was a community that lost absolutely everything, cataclysmically, and we can relate in some cataclysmic examples in the world in our own lifetimes. But within months of that cataclysm, this small group of people who literally had nothing and literally lost everything were rebuilding. They were attracting investment from globally. Investors from London were pouring money into Seattle because they had this vision and this common purpose that there was something here to rebuild and a future to build toward. And so the story that we tell of the Great Seattle Fire is not just that the city burned down, it's really that the city rebuilt. That's really the legacy of the fire. And how can we look at that experience and say, when we are faced with challenges, what's the pathway, not to dwell on the challenges that have been created, but what's the pathway to finding the success in the future that's going to come from that? And there's so many examples in Seattle history that we can learn from.
I really think that's an important thing to underscore about the role of the museum. It's not simply to look at some old artifacts. And in fact, you bring a lot of things to life in the Seattle Fire exhibit and many others. Are you constantly using new technologies and new means to make the exhibits more relevant or lively?
Well, we have a really exciting project right now, which is we are actually reimagining all of our core exhibits. So, we're a pretty big museum with a lot of exhibits and displays, but some of them are sort of the core story, the chronologic history of Seattle, the focus on our culture of innovation. Those core exhibits, we're actually in the process of completely reimagining right now. We're working with local historians, with community and business advisors, with a very, very well-known New York design firm, Ralph Applebaum Associates. And we are hoping that in mid-2028, when you walk into MOHAI, you're going to see something quite different than what you see now. So that's where we're going to have a chance to really lean into some of the new ways of storytelling. I mean, yes, new technology, but in the service of telling stories, of sharing history, of making the experience more impactful for our visitors. So we're looking forward to that, and there are lots of ways we're going to do that, and some of them I can share with you, and some of them are under wraps.
No, that's quite exciting. And people who are in the Seattle area, visitors to Seattle, should definitely put MOHAI on their list of places to visit, not only because of the exhibits inside, but the setting on South Lake Union is like the crux of so much of what's happening in the new Seattle. When I moved to Seattle, South Lake Union was known for a bunch of warehouses,
Mhm.
furniture warehouses, although not Boeing related, and this big tow truck with a pink thumb on it. And that's what we would drive by and say, wow, this is the highlight of South Lake Union. Maybe you can reflect a little bit on what that location means to you in terms of not just the draw for the museum, but just being there.
Yeah. I love being there. I love being there, Alex. We moved to South Lake Union when it was making that, you used the word pivot. It was making that pivot from sort of the backyard, the sort of light warehouse, light industrial fringe of the city into really being the center point of the city's future. It's actually geographically truly the center of Seattle. There's even a engineer's marking that says this is the center of Seattle, somewhere in the South Lake Union neighborhood. And Lake Union, which was such a sort of almost an afterthought to the central part of the city, has really become a front yard. And having the museum there is such a great opportunity. But it's also this interesting link because the Armory building itself is a building that's served during World War II. It was really built to help train troops during the war. But it's on the physical site of what was one of the very first sawmills in Seattle history, one owned by David Denny. So we know the Denny name, long and revered in Seattle history. But even before that, it was the site of Coast Salish native villages and encampments. So there's this incredible continuous history at that location, and all layers of that history are still reflected. And then to now see it as the hub of our biotech industry, of course, of Amazon and Google, it's just a tremendously exciting place to be. And as I look at the park that surrounds our building, Lake Union Park, and I see the families there and people not only new to Seattle, but new to the United States, people from all over the world who have come to Seattle, specifically to South Lake Union, to work in our innovative industries, in our uh, incredible companies, and to see them now becoming part of Seattle, helping to shape our history. That's really exciting. It's the ideal place for a history museum to be.
One of your neighbors there is the Center for Wooden Boats, and they have beautiful handmade canoes and sailboats and uh, boats that are really reflecting the craftsmanship of an era that is very important to preserve, I think, today. And it's important for knowledge workers to see that there's a lot of things made with our hands that maybe are a better reflection of our genius, right? Other than just being able to write great code. And I'm thinking about this in relation to the everyday objects that are in MOHAI. You did an exhibit on denim. You do exhibits that really give people a more tactile experience. And how do you think that can help people today? Maybe especially, your younger visitors who come through the museum.
Yeah, that's really a great comment, Alex, because we are a knowledge-based economy today, but that's an outgrowth of a crafts-based industrial base, which in turn was based on people who really were kind of creating the city from scratch, if you will. And that's everything from thinking of things to actually physically building things. I think there's a real tie there. But what I love about museums, and I think this is especially important as we move into the world of AI, is that museums are distinguished by authenticity. The everyday things we have are the real everyday things. The unique things we have are truly unique. It's really the difference between authenticity and artificiality. And I think that in a world where reality is beginning to assume sort of a new shape, if you will, having the chance to encounter the truly authentic is a very, very special opportunity and really a responsibility of museums like MOHAI. So, yes, I absolutely salute the Center for Wood and Boats. We have a canoe carving center that's being built by United Indians of all tribes right in the park that will open next year. And there's so much in MOHAI itself that is about the pre-digital age that reflects the very same creativity that shaped the digital age, but it's done it, as you say, Alex, in a tactile way, in a physical, tangible way. And those authentic things are actually in the museum and at Center for Wood and Boats.
Not that you haven't tackled AI, and in fact, I think MOHA did an exhibit 3 years ago on artificial intelligence. Back maybe right before the seminal date, right? Was it November 2022 when OpenAI released Chat GPT to the public? So, what did that mean back then? I mean, what gave you a crazy idea to talk about something like AI 3 years ago in a museum setting?
Well, we knew Seattle was beginning to get a foothold as an AI center, and we knew that was going to be historic. And so, again, thinking about Seattle as a culture of innovation, where history is literally being made in the moment, we thought this is something where we can use our framework as a history museum to foretell what will be historic in retrospect. But what was so interesting about the AI show is that it was really presented as a novelty. It was really presented as this is something kind of interesting. It's maybe kind of scary. It's definitely going to shape our future, but we can put it over here as a object of curiosity. And in those several years since we had that exhibit, which was very well received and very well attended, lots of positive impact, people were quite intrigued by it. We realize now that no, this is not just something for our amusement. This is really completely going to frame experience going forward. And I think that's the difference we've seen so dramatically just in a very short period of time.
Well, maybe you should bring that exhibit back because you could probably get $100 million in funding from, one of the big AI giants right now.
Well, the AI giants are all here, and I have to say the AI giants have already been very generous to MOHAI. So, and I mean that's something I think we should really, we should be so proud of our community, both our locally grown businesses like Microsoft and Amazon, but also the Silicon Valley firms that have big footholds here, like Google and Meta. They've all been quite generous, at least, and they've been great partners with MOHAI. So as we tell stories of history that relates to them, they've always been good partners with us.
And Jeff Bezos has always been a foundational partner for MOHAI and the concept of telling the public about innovation and the importance of technology. And does that mean that you will get to ride in a space ship at some point to an asteroid or the moon?
Well, that does sound fun. I don't know. I haven't seen that show up on my calendar yet, but I'll be looking for that. But Alex, one of the things is think about Lake Union. I'm going to go back to our
Okay,
history
back to
here,
Earth. Okay,
if you will,
excellent.
if you will.
You're so grounded, Leonard.
I'm so grounded. But, I mentioned that this location where we are in South Lake Union in general has a history that goes back for, millennia. But every one of those iconic transformations in Seattle happened at that very location. So Boeing's, not only was Denny's first timber mill there, but Boeing's first planes, the one that you were referring to that's at MOHAI, was actually built and took off on Lake Union, right there at South Lake Union. And then we see, the first railroad connection in Seattle, the first arrival of coal in Seattle, the first streetcar in Seattle, all were at South Lake Union. And then, of course, Paul Allen had this incredible vision that South Lake Union would actually be a front door to the city rather than an afterthought. And then, of course, Jeff Bezos and Amazon having such a major transformative presence, our biotech industry. I don't know. We'd have to look long and hard to find a community that had one location where so much history over such a long period of time took place and where each layer of that history is still visible, which is really, quite amazing.
And it's important to honor that past. And just to keep on the theme of flight, I'm thinking about the Smithsonian today and the challenge the Smithsonian is facing in being forced to revise history according to what the current administration views as history. Have you thought about that challenge and how you might have to face that if someone came to you and said, we don't like the way you've been, portraying the pioneers or some group. How does a museum director process that?
That's probably the toughest question the field is facing right now. A colleague of mine, our public historian emeritus, a great historian named Lorraine McConaughey, used to say that history is dangerous. Even back then, she would say that. And I would sometimes say, Lorraine, history is not dangerous. It's intriguing and it's interesting. But I think what she was getting at, and what we see so clearly in the Trump administration, is that history can be subverted to being a tool for really trying to reframe what our current reality is by making us either disbelieve or come to an incorrect belief about what our foundations are, what our building blocks are. And what MOHAI and every history museum has to be absolutely committed to is to present the truth based on scholarship, based on a nonpartisan approach, based on a breadth of perspectives, and have a space where people are comfortable to engage with that, to be in dialogue with that, and to begin to find the common truths that we can accept. We hold these truths, the great foundational words in American democracy. And museums have to hold to the truth based on evidence and based on scholarship. And so, Alex, I think I would say if we were faced with that challenge, I think we'd hold firm to our principles. And if that meant we would lose certain support or we'd alienate certain audiences, I think we'd be willing to take that risk. I know we would be.
We are chatting with Leonard Garfield, the longtime executive director of the Museum of History and Industry in Seattle. I want to stay on this theme of history for a second. I do think history is dangerous, sometimes to the people who write it. I was down in Mexico City a few years ago, and they have a wonderful anthropology museum where they talk about the various conquests of Mexico going way back to Aztecs. But the first thing that the new ruler did was he brought in all these scribes who worked for the old ruler, and they broke their fingers. And the message there was, we don't like what you wrote about the old guy, and we're going to bring in a new regime. So how do you know when they've come in to break your fingers, Leonard? When is that moment, just as a historian?
I guess there is that risk of shooting the messenger when you're the
Yeah.
historian, right? And I think in many cultures that has been true. There have been people who said, we don't like the way you're telling history. We've had donors who have said, we don't like this speaker and we're not going to donate anymore. We've recently lost funding from the federal government for projects because they said they weren't in alignment with American values. Interestingly, we have a project that was being funded by a federal agency that was to make the physical accessibility of some of our display accessible to young people who did not have full physical mobility. To us, it was a project that expanded access to the resources that we have, expanded access to history for everybody. And we got a letter from the federal government saying that did not align with American values. That was heartbreaking, to be honest with you. But we did not do the project. We continued to do the project, and we did it by finding other funders or digging deeper in other ways. So we've had those instances where people say, maybe not break your fingers, but maybe twist your arm. And I think we've been pretty resolute that we're not going to let that happen. And, we live in such a great community in that perspective, and some would say a bubble. And there's a danger in being in a bubble, because the danger is you don't think it will ever happen to you. And I think what we need to do is look beyond our bubble and recognize that that could very well happen to us. And we have to really, really both lean in and dig down into our mission to share the story of this region in an unbiased, in a truthful way with everybody.
Leonard, I think what we're getting at in this conversation is the role of a museum as an educational institution. And I know when I visited, you see school groups that are coming through. How do you orient your philosophy and even your scheduling in the museum to accommodate this educational mission, which, I think it's so important for kids today to be exposed to the kind of things that you have?
Education is core to what we do. We serve about 20 to 30,000 kids a year in formal education programs. We're one of those museums where you don't really come in and, we remember this from our childhood, right? You went on a field trip and you'd go into a big museum and you'd spend an hour or two running around and crazy and throwing things at each other. We don't do that. So sorry about that, kids. But what we do is we send curriculum material out to the classrooms ahead of time, so the young people are prepared. Our experiences in the museum are actually class experiences. Kids are engaging directly with artifacts, with history. They're learning from historians. And then they go back to their classroom and they have follow-up activities. What we're essentially doing is providing the content that helps teachers meet the learning standards in history and social studies. So they've got the standards. The kids need to become civically literate. They need to understand cause and effect. They need to understand, the history of this region. But the classrooms don't always have the materials to actually teach that. That's where MOHAI comes in. And we're really unique in the region in that regard. And so we are working with school districts in dozens of counties around the state, actually, tens of thousands of kids every year. And it is absolutely core to what we do. So we've got a great team of teachers. We try to keep up with the latest standards in pedagogy and in classroom instruction. And for classrooms that can't make it to MOHAI, we've got trunks that go out filled with artifacts and lesson plans and really great stuff. They will go into a classroom, be there for a month or so, and give kids something of the experience as if they were at the museum.
That's so important to offer that kind of in-person look and feel experience for a kid who might be bored in a classroom, but when he or she sees these artifacts up front and just photos of people who came before them, I think that this is a real education experience. I remember when I was a kid, I was fortunate to grow up in New York City and go to the Museum of Natural History on field trips. They had these dioramas of,
We still do, Alex.
the founding of New York City by, Peter Minuet. Of course, it's all told by the perspective of a 1604 Dutch, conquistador. Anyway, I guess one day I missed the school, forgot to bring me back home on the bus. And I was left in the museum for several hours, sort of like a Home Alone adventure.
Wow.
But this might explain some things about my personality. I'm not sure. You don't have to respond to that.
Well, no, I want to respond to that because I think that's fascinating. I mean, if I ever leave this job, if they ever let me leave, I think, Alex, you've got a deeper root in museum experience than I do. You actually lived in a diorama. You were the kid. You were the little kid from New York that was in.
I am the little kid. And if I were a kid today visiting MOHAI, first of all, the diversity of these exhibits is incredible. Let's just talk about Ichiro. You did an exhibit on maybe one of our most famous players of all time, Ichiro Suzuki, who played for the Mariners, and his role as a global icon. Tell me what you learned from that. And is it easy to portray a sports figure in a museum setting?
Well, this was such a fun thing to do because Ichiro, of course, was inducted into the Hall of Fame this summer. And we thought that's history. And Ichiro's career spanned not just different cities in the United States, but obviously different countries around the world. So we thought this is so characteristically Seattle. This is a person who came from another part of the world, did amazing things here, is still connected globally. So much of our own Seattle history reflects those same themes. So we wanted to do a shout out. We do have incredible, generous individuals in our community who were able to loan us artifacts from their own private collections to tell that story. And it's just a small display, but it's the first thing you see now when you walk into the museum. And Alex, we're going to keep it up through the World Series so that when the Mariners win the World Series, they'll be able to celebrate, and we can celebrate at MOHAI and reflect on Ichiro, who still, of course, is in our community and still is a part of this winning culture that the Mariners have created. You love sports history because I've discovered, and we've done some exhibits we're going to be doing an exhibit on soccer next year to time with the World Cup. We've done exhibits on rowing. And what I've discovered, and we've done other exhibits on baseball and other sports, everybody connects with sports. And especially as women's sports are gaining greater prominence and popularity, truly everybody gathers around sports as a form of community identity, a time and a place for celebration. And as we see with Ichiro, it even shows a reflection of the values historically that have been important in the community. So yeah, it's very fun to look at things that people don't think of as historic and look a little deeper and see that actually they are part of our history and they're reflecting so many of the historic patterns that shape us.
What's the future of museums and what's the future of MOHAI? How do you stay as popular as you are today?
I think the future of museums is a really challenging question, particularly in the context of AI. Museums, I think for the last 20 years or so, have sort of played around with AR and VR and ER, really as just different ways of delivering content or creating slightly different experiences. I don't think that's what AI is. I think AI is a wholly different way of approaching how we come to each other and how we understand history in the case of our museum, but really how we understand experience. It's very different than just a headset that museums were experimenting with a few years ago. I don't know where that experiment's going to lead, but where I think it has to be rooted is what I had said earlier, which is that museums have an obligation to be a place of truth, and they have an obligation to build on authenticity. How that then is leveraged through an AI framework, I think is going to be the real challenge for museums. And MOHAI, to our case, is part of that conversation, part of that exploration. And I'm hoping that as we reimagine our core exhibits over these next few years, working with the community, making sure that the best history and the best community voices are included in our exploration, I'm hoping that we will be an example of how AI can be a tool that makes what we do for the community even stronger, but always deeply rooted in truth and authenticity.
I mean, that's a very profound note to sound, and I'm glad you sounded it. I think we are living in an environment where access to information has never been easier. You can certainly pose questions in search or AI and get instant answers that seem very credible. And yet, it's the exploration of what went into that credible answer that is really important. And I'm not just talking about historical role, but the ability to research that and understand the context for it. If AI is used as a tool, it's an amazing tool. It can direct your research and it can find very specific areas of knowledge that weren't accessible before. On the other hand, if it's just telling you an answer that it thinks you want to hear, then that's very dangerous.
Yeah,
How do
that
we
is
how
so
do we
true.
navigate that?
It's the answer you want to hear, or the answer that has already been developed by others and is simply being collected for you, and it's not new information. And yet AI will move to that phase. And Alex, you're the expert, so I'm sure we're already there, where it's not just the accumulation of existing information, but it's actually moving generatively into new information. I think that's really, really a fascinating and challenging thing to think about. I was recently talking with some corporate partners that I'm working with on a history. And we were thinking about not just how we present information, but how people receive it. And we have audiences that have very little information and they need to learn a lot, or they have very much information and they want to be reinforced, or we have people who have misinformation. So we've got the low information, the high information, and the misinformation. All of these are kind of new, and we as museums have to figure out how to thread the needle to find the real information that is actually going to move us forward. And AI will help with that, but we have to be fully prepared to understand how it can be helpful before we, fully engage with it.
I think Seattle is very lucky to have an institution that is an educational institution, a historical institution, and also a salute to technology, all wrapped in one. And so that it's not presented just as a history lesson or as something that, you need to attend for a day. It's part of what I would call lifelong learning. And we have to really treasure the institutions that we have right now. I don't want to see MOHAI turned into a chatbot where I just come to the front door and I get somebody talking to me based on my, prompts.
Right.
Please promise you won't turn the museum into a chatbot.
I promise I will not do that. They will not make a robotic version of me, having me tell you what you want to hear.
Although in a diorama, it might be a fine setting for, the
That's
history,
right.
the
We'll
history of
create a
MOHAI.
diorama just for you, Alex. It will be your grown-up diorama.
Okay. Well, Leonard, it has been a pleasure having you discuss history, technology, culture, the challenge to culture in this discussion, and we really appreciate the time and encourage people to visit MOHAI or MOHAI org in Seattle on the internet or wherever your travels might take you. Rebecca?
Thanks, Leonard Garfield, for joining us on the Responsible AI podcast from the AI Forum. You can subscribe to the Responsible AI podcast on Spotify, YouTube, Apple, or wherever you like to listen. See what we've been reading about the legal and ethical implications of AI on our website, theaiforum.org.